Think you know the whole story? Turns out you were probably taught the half-truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a doctor. What do you see? Probably a white coat, a kind face, a stethoscope draped around their neck. Maybe they're holding a clipboard, looking over lab results. They represent science, data, and a commitment to, first and foremost, do no harm. It's an image of safety, of modern, evidence-based care. Now, let's rewind the clock. Picture a doctor from a few centuries ago. The setting is dimmer, maybe lit by candles. The tools on the table aren't scanners and syringes, but polished steel lancets, glass cups for suction, and a porcelain bowl to catch blood. This is the archetypal image of pre-modern medicine, the physician as a purveyor of bloodletting. We learned about this in school. It feels like a grim, almost ghoulish footnote in the story of medical progress. We're told that for 2,000 years, from the time of Hippocrates to the dawn of the 20th century, bleeding a patient was the go-to treatment for almost everything. Fever, bleed them. Pneumonia, bleed them. Melancholy, bleed them. The story we are told is one of earnest, if misguided, effort. These weren't monsters. They were the best and brightest of their time, operating on the cutting edge of their scientific understanding. The practice was universal, endorsed by the most respected medical minds in history. It was the standard of care. George Washington, on his deathbed, was famously bled of nearly 4 liters of blood by his trusted physicians in less than a day. They were trying to save him, using the most advanced technique they knew. It's a neat story. It fits our comforting narrative of progress, of humanity marching out of the darkness of ignorance into the light of science. We can look back, shake our heads at their primitive ways, and feel secure in our own enlightened age. But what if that story isn't the whole story? What if the idea that bloodletting was a scientifically sound treatment for its time is the biggest myth of all? What if, for 2 millennia, the entire edifice of Western medicine was built on a foundation not of bad science, but of no science at all? Today, we are pulling on the thread of medicine's most persistent and deadly half-truth, the belief that for centuries, doctors were right to bleed their patients. To understand the myth, you first have to understand the story we were all taught. It's an elegant, almost beautiful system in its own way. The theory, which originates in ancient Greece with thinkers like Hippocrates and was later canonized by the Roman physician Galen, is called humoralism. It proposed that the human body was composed of 4 fundamental substances, or humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each humor corresponded to one of the 4 classical elements: air, water, earth, and fire, and was associated with a particular season and a specific human temperament. Blood was associated with air, springtime, and a sanguine or cheerful disposition. Phlegm was linked to water, winter, and a phlegmatic or calm personality. Black bile corresponded to earth, autumn, and a melancholic sadness, and yellow bile was tied to fire, summer, and a choleric or angry temperament. A healthy person was someone in whom these 4 humors were in perfect balance. Sickness, therefore, was simply a state of imbalance, too much of one humor or not enough of another, and the body's entire system was thrown out of whack. The logic, from there, is deceptively simple. If illness is an excess of a humor, the treatment is to remove that excess. And of all the humors, which one is the most visible, the most accessible? Blood, the vibrant life-giving fluid that was believed to be the most dominant humor of all. An excess of blood, a condition known as plethora, was thought to be the root cause of countless ailments, especially those involving fever, inflammation, and redness, all signs of heat, which was associated with blood. The cure then was obvious. Open a vein and let the badness out. Let the body return to its natural, harmonious state. This wasn't some fringe folk remedy. This was the unshakable bedrock of Western medicine for over 1,500 years, largely thanks to the influence of Galen of Pergamon. Galen, who lived in the 2nd century AD, was a physician to Roman emperors. He was a brilliant anatomist for his time, and he wrote hundreds of treatises that synthesized and expanded upon Greek medical knowledge. His work was so comprehensive, so logically consistent within its own framework that it became medical dogma. For centuries after his death, to be a doctor didn't mean to conduct experiments. It meant to have mastered the texts of Galen. And Galen was a huge proponent of bloodletting. He created elaborate systems detailing precisely where on the body to make an incision for a specific ailment, how much blood to take, and what time of day was most auspicious. So the story we know is this. For generation after generation, doctors inherited this elegant humoral theory. They used their tools, the sharp lancet for venesection or opening a vein, the scarificator, a spring-loaded device with multiple blades for making shallow cuts, and of course, the medicinal leech, all in service of this guiding principle. When a patient recovered, it was proof the theory worked. When they died, it was simply because the illness was too severe for even this powerful intervention to overcome. The practice persisted because it was the logical application of the best scientific model they had. It seems reasonable, tragic, but ultimately understandable. This is why the myth is so compelling. It reinforces our faith in the scientific method itself. We see there humoral theory as a kind of primitive hypothesis that was eventually disproven and replaced by a better one, like germ theory. It's a clean narrative of trial and error, a testament to how science self-corrects over time. But this tidy story hides a much more uncomfortable and fascinating truth. It papers over the fact that the real reason bloodletting lasted so long had very little to do with evidence, and everything to do with authority, tradition, and a complete failure to ask one simple, devastating question. The first thread we need to pull to unravel this half-truth is a simple one. In all those centuries of bleeding millions of patients, did anyone ever actually stop and check if it was working? Did anyone think to compare a group of patients who were bled with a similar group who were not, and see who did better? The answer, for the most part, is a resounding no. That entire way of thinking, of testing a hypothesis against controlled observation, is the cornerstone of modern science. But it simply wasn't part of the medical tradition that venerated bloodletting. The practice was not based on empirical data. It was based on deduction from ancient principles. A doctor's credibility came not from his cure rate, but from his ability to quote Galen, to explain the patient's sickness in the complex language of the humors. It was a system of philosophy, not of science. The body was a black box. You couldn't see the humors inside, but the theory provided a confident explanation for what was happening. When a patient had a fever and a flushed face, the doctor wasn't observing a symptom and forming a hypothesis. He was seeing a confirmation of what he already knew, an excess of the hot, wet humor of blood. The treatment was preordained. This created a powerful cycle of confirmation bias. Think about it. Most illnesses, especially in the pre-antibiotic era, were self-limiting. Things like colds, flus, and many infections would eventually get better on their own. So, a patient gets sick, the doctor performs a bloodletting, and a few days later, the patient starts to recover. What does everyone conclude? The bloodletting worked. It was a miracle of modern medicine. Conversely, if the patient got worse or died, no one blamed the treatment. They blamed the disease. It was just too aggressive, too deeply rooted for the bleeding to overcome. The logic was unfalsifiable. The treatment worked when the patient got better, and the disease was too strong when the patient died. The therapy itself was never in question. Of course, there were dissenters. Throughout history, astute observers did notice that patients who were bled often seemed to do worse. In the 12th century, the Jewish philosopher-physician Maimonides cautioned against its overuse. In the 16th century, the rebellious Paracelsus openly burned the books of Galen and Avicenna, arguing for medicine based on observation of nature rather than ancient texts. In the 17th century, the physician William Harvey, who discovered the circulation of blood, expressed his own private doubts about the practice. But these were voices in the wilderness. The medical establishment was a rigid hierarchy built on the authority of the ancients. To question bloodletting wasn't just to question a single procedure. It was to question the entire intellectual foundation of medicine. It was to imply that Galen, the master, was wrong. It was to suggest that your professors and their professors before them were all wrong. It was professional suicide. The practice wasn't a scientific hypothesis to be tested. It was a quasi-religious ritual to be performed. The very act of bloodletting reinforced the doctor's status and power. It was a dramatic, tangible intervention. In an age with few effective medicines, it was something a doctor could do, demonstrating his knowledge and taking decisive action. To simply prescribe rest and fluids felt passive, almost like an admission of ignorance. Bleeding was active, authoritative, and deeply, profoundly wrong. The real story of bloodletting isn't one of a flawed scientific theory. It's the story of how a philosophical dogma, once entrenched, can hold the human mind captive for centuries, impervious to contradictory evidence and common sense. The tide only began to turn when a new way of thinking about medicine finally emerged. The hero of this story isn't a man who discovered a new drug, but a man who discovered a new way to count. His name was Pierre Charles Alexander Louis, and he was a French physician working in the 1820s and 30s. Louis was part of a new, radical school of thought emerging in Paris, one that was deeply skeptical of traditional medical theories. He believed that doctors should trust numbers more than ancient authorities. He called his method the méthode numérique, or the numerical method. Today, we'd call it clinical statistics. His approach was revolutionary. Instead of treating patients based on abstract principles, he would meticulously observe and document the outcomes of large groups of patients, then analyze the data to see what actually worked. Louis decided to apply his numerical method to the most common and revered treatment of his day, bloodletting. He chose to study its effect on patients with pneumonia. For years, he followed 77 pneumonia patients at a Paris hospital, carefully recording their symptoms, when they were bled, how much blood was taken, and crucially, whether they lived or died. The medical establishment expected his results to provide the first-ever quantitative proof of bloodletting's effectiveness. When he published his findings in 1835, they were a bombshell. The numbers told a story that flew in the face of 2,000 years of medical wisdom. Lewis found that bloodletting had no positive effect on the outcome of pneumonia. In fact, his data suggested the opposite. Patients who were bled later in their illness, or more aggressively, had a higher mortality rate than those who were bled less or not at all. For the first time, the emperor of all maladies had been shown to have no clothes. The most prestigious treatment in medicine was, according to the stark reality of the numbers, a sham. The reaction was not gratitude. It was outrage. The leading proponent of bloodletting at the time, a physician named François-Joseph Victor Broussais, who was infamous for his aggressive use of bleeding and leeches, furiously attacked Lewis. He and his powerful allies dismissed the numerical method as crude and misleading. They argued that it ignored the individual complexities of each patient, that medicine was an art, not a simple matter of counting. They were, in essence, defending their professional identity. They had built their careers, their prestige, and their entire understanding of the body on the foundation of humoral theory and bloodletting. To accept Lewis's findings would be to accept that their life's work was not just useless, but actively harmful. It was an admission they couldn't bear to make. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next several decades, Lewis's numerical method gained traction. More and more physicians began to adopt a statistical, evidence-based approach. At the same time, monumental discoveries were fundamentally changing the understanding of disease. In the mid-19th century, the development of the microscope and the rise of cellular pathology showed that diseases were located in specific tissues and organs, not in a free-floating imbalance of humors. Then, with the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, germ theory arrived. Suddenly, doctors had a new target: microscopic invaders. The enemy wasn't an internal imbalance, but an external foe. This new model of disease required new treatments. The idea of bleeding someone to fight off bacteria seemed as nonsensical as it truly was. Bloodletting didn't vanish overnight. It faded away slowly, a ghost that haunted the halls of medicine well into the late 19th century. But its intellectual justification had crumbled. It was replaced not by a new theory of bleeding, but by a new definition of medicine itself, one based on observation, experimentation, and evidence. It is worth noting that modern medicine does use therapeutic phlebotomy for a handful of rare conditions like hemochromatosis, where the body has a toxic iron overload, or polycythemia vera, a disorder involving the overproduction of red blood cells. In these specific cases, removing blood is effective, but these are exquisitely rare exceptions that prove the rule. For the vast majority of ailments it was used for, bloodletting was a dangerous folly. So we arrive back at our half-truth. Was bloodletting a mainstream medical treatment based on the best science of its day? The answer is a carefully constructed yes and no. Yes, it was mainstream. But no, it was not based on science as we understand it, a process of hypothesis, testing, and verification. It was based on a philosophical tradition that went untested and unchallenged for centuries out of reverence for authority. The story we tell ourselves of a primitive but logical scientific model is a comforting revision. The real story is a far more unsettling cautionary tale. Correcting this half-truth matters because it reveals the profound difference between dogma and science. Dogma is a set of beliefs handed down by authority that you are taught to defend. Science is a method of inquiry that you are taught to use to question everything, especially the beliefs of authority. The long, dark reign of bloodletting shows what happens when a field of knowledge chooses the path of dogma. It stagnates for millennia, perpetuating harm in the name of tradition. It teaches us that good intentions and a logical-sounding theory are not enough. Without a culture of skepticism, without the humble willingness to admit we might be wrong, let's test it. Medicine can become a system for justifying its own existence rather than a tool for healing. The story of bloodletting isn't just a quaint, morbid curiosity from the history books. It is a permanent and vital reminder that the most powerful tool in medicine is not a lancet or a drug, but the courage to ask, how do we know that's true? It shows us that even the most universally accepted ideas, endorsed by the most brilliant minds, can be catastrophically wrong for a very, very long time. The history of medicine is not a clean, straight line of progress, but a messy, ongoing struggle against our own certainty. Now you know the real story. What other half-truths are still out there? If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time. Until then, stay curious.